Eli Lilly released new obesity data last week. It did not impress investors, but was it all that bad? On the latest BioCentury This Week podcast, we'll discuss why Lilly's oral GLP-1 should have a leg up in the market. Plus, we'll talk about revamping a 30-year-old biotech, Acadia, the return of the Biosecure Act, and we'll touch on Vinay Prasad's return to FDA. Joining me to discuss all of this are
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
All right, the whirlwind year at FDA continues. Our colleague Steve would normally be all over this, but he has skipped town to enjoy his usual August vacation. And so, Simone, why don't you fill us in on what is happening in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, never a dull moment here in DC in this particular era. So, as you pointed out, Vinay Prasad is back. Head of CBER, that's the Center for Biologics and Evaluation Research. Have I got that right? Some words in that order like that, CBER. And
as long as you don't put a D in there, then
well, so therein lies the story, right? Because he is basically, as I'm sure all our listeners know, so we won't get into that much detail, he is and was the head of the unit that regulates biologics like cell and gene therapies, in addition, of course, to vaccines, a highly charged topic in this particular administration. I don't think we'll know and ever know. He really went on behind the scenes, but he tendered his resignation. What is it, Jeff? 2 weeks ago?
Something around then.
Something like 2 weeks ago, and then
He tendered it long enough ago to go to Italy and then come back.
So, now he's back, and there's really a lot of conversations because he actually went to spend more time with his family. As somebody who's about to spend a lot of time with their family, I'm kind of wondering, with a lot of family, I'm kind of wondering whether he was like, you know what, running CBER is easier than this.
Yeah, my mom's like, will come visit me. She begs me to live closer. Then she visits and she's like, it's like fish, 3 days and it starts to stink. It's like, Mom, I'm your baby.
Well, I got to tell you, I'm trying to put together, just to get some people together of my family coming from all over the world, find a time where we can all celebrate a very, happy engagement, and really running CBER is easier. I got to say that, running even in this time. But I do know that there are other theories. Stephen, do you want to give one of the other theories?
Yeah, well, so as I sort of alluded to, I think one of the theories was that he just hadn't earned enough of his PTO time, and so this was sort of a way to be able to get off on a nice little vacation and then come right back. So yeah, I mean, it's actually something I might consider. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, try it. Just try it, Stephen. Go ahead. Just try it. I may not be as loving as the people, they were desperate. Macri was very keen for him to come back.
You're not going to be my Marty. You're not going to be my Marty McCary, Simone,
and
beg me to come back. And
go ahead, Selena. You want to bring us back to
Gonna mention the big downside here, right? Which is that constant upheaval, one thing after another. It could probably be the worst part of this for the industry.
Yeah, I think that's it. And Steve is certainly going to get into this when he comes back. But let's just go through a few of the things that have happened, which is Prasad beforehand had been very, very critical of Peter Marks, his predecessor, for overruling decisions made by the staff under him, right, in terms of approvals. Prasad then came in and did exactly the same thing himself. In addition to that, what actually happened is the Raplamune case is one, but there were a couple of others. We talked about it previously on the pod. There were CBER decisions or CRLs that basically reversed what the former FDA guidance had been. And now, after he went, all the biopharmers were like, well, what does this mean going forward? Now he's back. They're still like, what does this mean going forward? So to your point of uncertainty, Selena, I think there's a certain level of uncertainty, but there might be people going, hang on, we were just getting used to Prasad, beginning to understand, and not everybody disagreed with everything he did, just to be very clear. There's that sort of, we don't know what the uncertainty, we're uncertain about the uncertainty level is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, like how long is he back? Is McCary, I don't know.
Well, and I think as we were talking about earlier, Simone, like you were saying on our morning editorial call that, you're out talking to CEOs, and the one thing they want to know is when will this biotech winter end? And now you've got to lump in this turmoil at FDA, the constant changing, as part of that, because biotechs just need to plan. They need to know what the regulatory pathways are.
Right. I mean, I think a couple of things are becoming clear. So the administration's pullback on mRNA funding is part of this big picture. It's just impossible for me to see Prasad take a stance that is very pro-vaccine, that is going to push back and say, no, mRNA vaccines actually have saved many lives. That's not what he said in the past. So I think that having him there, or even anyone under this administration in that particular part of drug development, I think we all know that is, I would say, a big cloud. I think many people feel it's really a bad situation for FDA to be in and public health to be in. But there's another thing that is kind of becoming clear, which is that even though Peter Marks had a pretty high profile, it wasn't a higher profile than the head of CEDA. And right now, Prasad is getting more ink, should we say, more headlines, more attention than the head of CEDA. And it sort of suggests that he might have more power there. Now he's back. He's actually got tremendous power, arguably. And so it'll be very interesting, as we pointed out and discussed on our call before, Jeff, because what he's in charge of, which is sort of cell and gene therapies, is really not the majority of drug development. And yet that's where a lot of the attention is.
But is he back as chief scientific and medical officer over FDA? And does he also like the commissioner's new priority voucher? Is he still in charge of that as well?
We don't know that yet. At least the last thing I saw, at least before coming on this pod, I hadn't seen anything confirming that. But we do know that the FDA commissioner, Marty Makary, is a big fan of Prasad's.
That is true. All right. Well, Steve, as Simone said, he'll be back. He'll dig into this, and as always,
say it with fancier words and just a lot more insight. Let's be honest.
Yes.
Than PTO.
You bet. Well, this all fits nicely into our annual back to school issue, the theme of back to school, and as we believe in equity here at BioCentury, many of our longtime readers know we always publish back to school right around Labor Day, when kids on the East Coast of America are going back to school. But hey, Selena and I are already starting to make those delicious sandwiches for our kids' lunch this week as they're heading back to school this week. So what better to do than to publish back to school this week and then return once our friends in Europe are back from vacation and double dip and release the package once again, complete with a podcast as well. And so if you're newer to BioCentury and you don't know what back to school is, well, we've been doing it every year since BioCentury's David Flores and Karen Bernstein founded BioCentury more than 3 decades ago. It is a forward-looking package that looks at a broad issue critical to the biopharma industry. Here to give us a sneak peek is Simone.
Well, thank you, Jeff. First of all, I would say I really hated making those school lunches so much that I didn't do it. Either my husband did it or they did it themselves. So that's my advice. Get your spouse or your kids to make their own. But if you don't want parenting advice from me, I'm here to help tell you. And mine turned out pretty good, actually, I have to say. But anyway, I'm here to tell you about back to school. And now that he's not here, I can say really incredibly good things about Steve Usden. I know that he doesn't listen to the pod afterwards. But he has written this year's Back to School. It's really phenomenal, and it really shows the deep insights he has and the many years experience he has, like literally decades, of covering FDA and his deep sources in FDA and ex-FDA. And you'll understand that many of them will not want to have been identified, but I also want to make it very clear what this back to school is about. And we would have written it actually, that same topic, any administration, any environment. It's really about how would you build FDA from scratch? If you could redo it, most people understand and know, and there've been moves afoot to redesign and reorganize FDA. I think maybe that's just become heightened now, but that's really been a priority for a lot of people for a long while. And so what we did is we sort of said, okay, let's do the thought exercise. It's just you've got a blank slate. How would you build FDA for today and the future of medicines? And I'll let Selena weigh in with a few more thoughts in a minute, just to let you know that that is the main topic, reimagining FDA. It is not about today's FDA. It is about what it should look like. We do go down the history. We have a pretty nice history and some good graphics. And Steve talks about how it should be structured and brings up some provocative concepts. Selena, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, on the historical piece of it, I think people are often surprised when they learn that there was a day when drugs were approved first in Europe, so outside the US, and US was sort of a secondary destination. So some of the policies and the developments along the timeline that got us to how we are, where we are today, and how FDA also came to be a place that regulated tobacco and cosmetics and all of these things. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there that helps you understand the current kind of state of play. But yeah, going forward, I mean, do we want to get into the prescriptions he has in there or leave it for readers to read?
We'll leave it for readers to read.
Well, we'll have goodies for you every day this week, either one or more stories, starting Monday, running through Friday, and then once we come back from the Labor Day vacation in the US, that's September 1st this year, we'll put out the whole package in one go, and we'll follow up with the podcast. And we look forward to having you read it, as it's the biggest thing we publish every year. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to take a look at Lilly's obesity data and more.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe. Grand Rounds, BioCentury's R&D conference, will make its European debut in 2025. Join us to debate key translational bottlenecks and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us for the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Cambridge, UK, the September 17th to 19th. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
We are back, and well, last week, phase 3 data from Lilly's oral GLP-1 in obesity fell well short of investors' expectations. Stephen, did they expect too much?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so as you say, the headline news was that orforglipron, the name for their small molecule GLP-1, showed about 11.5% placebo-adjusted efficacy on weight loss. This resulted in Lilly losing what is the equivalent of a Vertex Pharma in market cap. So they lost about $95 billion. The worry from the buy side stems from two things. First, in phase 2, that same dose of orforglipron showed about 11.2% placebo-adjusted weight loss at 36 weeks. In that data, the trend line didn't really appear to be plateauing. So you can understand why you would kind of hope that those responses would have been stronger after 72 weeks. Secondly, I saw a lot of chatter about concerns of other oral therapies that are going to be coming that now they would expect will show better efficacy. So that's Viking's VK2735, which has phase 2 data coming this quarter for the oral formulation, and then also oral amycretin from Novo Nordisk, which is heading into phase 3 testing soon. So I just want to say a few things on each of those points. So based solely on the phase 2 data readout, I think it's entirely fair to call the phase 3 data disappointing. But what I think investors may have given a little bit too low of a credence to was the signal, or what you could maybe say the red flag that we got in June from the phase 3 data in type 2 diabetes. What's pretty well established now is that GLP-1s don't provide as much weight loss in diabetic patients as they do in obesity patients. And if you go back and look at some of the other semaglutide, tirzepatide, other molecules that have been further along and have had phase 3 data in both settings, what you typically see is that for both those programs, it's about 40 to 50% less weight loss in diabetic patients than obese patients. So when we saw 6% placebo-adjusted weight loss in the phase 3 diabetes study for orforglipron, that could have been a bit of a warning to investors that maybe their expectations were a little overwrought. Because if you extrapolate, if you kind of apply the same assumptions that you're going to see 40 to 50% less weight loss in diabetes for orforglipron, that basically points you to an 11 to 12% readout in obesity. which is what we got. So that's the first point. Secondly, there are going to probably be other oral obesity therapies that are going to come out with better efficacy data. I think that's a perfectly fair assumption to have. What I think people need to still take into consideration is the advantage you have as a small molecule relative to a peptide. The first, I mentioned Viking and amycretin, but really the first competitor is going to be Novo's 25 milligram oral dose of semaglutide. So that's already under review, probably going to get approved before orforglipron is going to get approved. That showed 13.9% placebo-adjusted weight loss in their phase 3 study. The issue is orforglipron showed numerically better GI tolerability than semaglutide in the phase 3 setting. Small molecule didn't show any liver tox, which is a known sort of problem with the small molecule GLP-1 programs. And again, being a small molecule, Lilly has a clear advantage in terms of scaling up manufacturing and meeting patient demand.
And what about the manufacturing advantage of there's oral, but there's oral peptide and there's oral small molecule.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's a good point, Celine. And I think I guess I would say I'm still skeptical about when it comes to the oral peptides and their ability to really dominate the obesity market. So just using the 25 milligram semaglutide as an example. So for the 25 milligram once daily dose that's now under review, that's 73 times the amount of API needed to treat an obesity patient for 1 week as compared to Novo's once weekly Wegovy. So that's a lot more peptide that they would need to manufacture to meet patients on an oral dose than they would need to meet on an injectable dose. And it's a similar thing as you get into some of the other ones. So we're saying 25 milligrams for semaglutide. They had an efficacious dose at 50 milligrams that they chose not to submit for regulatory approval because of concerns about being able to meet manufacturing capacity and scale. And I think some of the other peptides, the later ones like Viking and like oral amycretin, those are 100 milligrams a day being tested. So that's an even larger amount of API, peptide API that would be required. So that scalability issue, I think, is still a major barrier for an oral peptide therapy, taking a leadership position in this market. It's not to say that they can't get approved, and it's not to say that they can't be commercialized, but I don't think an oral peptide therapy is going to have the ability to sort of start stealing the market and steal demand when you have an oral small molecule that has much better scalability, much better COGS. And I think that's the other thing that people are maybe discounting with the small molecule. I mean, I think Lilly's going to have a lot more pricing power and ability to potentially price other people out of the market if they really wanted to. So that's, from my mind, I think that is just something that maybe investors weren't giving as much attention to as they maybe should have when all they were worried about was sort of what the headline number was.
Stephen, this is maybe a naive question, but the obesity medications have just made this massive impact. I know we're going to have a lot of puns unintended here, and really reshaping society. Lilly is literally laughing on the way to the bank, I think. Novo, has done pretty well. Novo, I know we talked about last week. I sort of wonder, are investors getting greedy in as much as their expectations? I mean, we talked about this offline, right? I mean, the results were in any normal world quite good. They just weren't amazing. Is investor expectation just unrealistic, or is that just the way of the world? You make this bar and now you've just always got to...
I think that's part of it. Part of it is that I think Lilly is one of the most closely followed and most closely covered from a sell side perspective, biopharma companies that we have. And so I think when you have that, and you keep hitting, price target bars and these sorts of things. And I'm not calling out any specific single analysts, but you might have situations where like, okay, well, how are we going to get more growth out of this stock? What do we need to see? They hit 700, they hit 800. Well, if our new price target's 950, what sort of, growth metrics do we need to see in the future, or peak sales metrics do we need to see to be able to justify that? And you plug it into your model, and all of a sudden you have this sort of consensus that orforglipron was going to be a $40 to $50 billion a year peak sales drug. And that's what expectations were at. And so then when you see this sort of a number, they have to downgrade expectations to just $25 billion a year. That's where I think sometimes these can kind of run a bit out of hand, because, I mean, my overall takeaway is that the data weren't a home run, but they're fine. I mean, this is an approvable drug. It's going to get used. And in the context of how I think the obesity market's going to sort of evolve here, I think that there's going to be a segment of patients where really high levels of efficacy are what they're going to be needing. And so you're going to have these high efficacy injectables that are going to fit a small portion of the population. But then there's going to be a majority of patients who aren't going to need 20% weight loss. They're going to be fine with 10 to 15%. That's where something like this, I think, could really work. You get patients down to a healthy weight. And so I think you combine that with the scalability advantage, the COGS, potential pricing advantage that you can have here. I don't see why this isn't going to do really well for them.
Stephen, what's next as far as data milestones?
Yeah, so I think the next really important one will be data that should be coming up either end of this year, could be early next year, but it's phase 3 data from their maintenance study. So here Lilly is looking at patients who actually completed treatment in a SURMOUNT-5 study, which was the study of tirzepatide, Zepbound, head-to-head versus Wegovy. And then they essentially were immediately enrolled into this study where they're taking orforglipron or placebo for a year to see whether they can maintain their weight loss after having basically come off an injectable. And so this is a segment of the obesity market that there are a lot of people are aiming for. So I know, when people talk about amylin monotherapy or activins, myostatins, siRNAs, all of them are really excited and really hyped about the idea of a maintenance setting where you can basically, people are on an injectable, they get their weight down, and then they transition to something else to help them keep that weight off so that you don't have the rebound. And this is what Lilly's testing. So they're seeing whether their oral GLP-1 can help keep that weight off long-term post-injection. And so I think this will be really interesting to see what the data reads out like. And I think it'll be really interesting to give us a sense as to how Lilly is thinking about in terms of positioning this product going forward. But that's sort of the next big shoe to drop, I think, for this program towards the end of the year.
Excellent. Thanks for that update, Stephen. Let's turn to Acadia. This is one of my favorite types of story in biotech. We have a company that is, well, they're as old as Biocentury, about 32 years old, and they are on the comeback path. They've made a pivot to rare disease, and they've rebuilt the management team, and Selena took a closer look. Selena, what did you learn?
Well, let's be cautiously optimistic here. They got a long way to go, but yeah, this is a classic biotech story. So they got an approval back in 2016 for a drug called Nuplazid. It treats psychosis related to Parkinson's disease. So a lot of people think of that as a motor disease, which it is, but it also can have psychosis associated with it. And its mechanism, it's an inverse agonist of a serotonin receptor, 5-HT2A for the aficionados out there. They thought it could be useful for a wide variety of things. So psychosis and other settings, such as in dementia at large or Alzheimer's more specifically, in schizophrenia, and then outside of psychosis, even in depression, which is a very large indication. And they started, marching through them, running the trials, and then it was just kind of one letdown after another there, slashing, their market cap by quite a lot. And they started their kind of retooling a while ago, and their kind of big first step toward if we can call it a comeback, the beginnings of a comeback, was an approval in a rare disease. So then near the middle of 2024, they got a new CEO, and they had just got a new head of R&D, and the new CEO brought on kind of new managers for the commercial side of things because she had saw a big opportunity in their new drug, their new rare disease drug, Daybue, which was the first and I think remains still the only therapy for Rett syndrome. And we've seen some wins on that front. They have been growing those sales, modernizing the way they go about commercialization. And I think the next step for them is really showing that they can have more programs behind this one.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting. We talk a lot about new companies, but there's a lot of very good veteran companies, longer standing companies, maybe. I think it looks to me like the board is doing its job, right? The board is saying, bring in new management. Let's look at what we've got. Let's work out how we maximize value here. So they've sort of pivoted to a focus on rare disease, and they say they've expanding sort of beyond just neuro. Most of their products are still within the neuro area, right? If I got that right. And can you just talk a little bit about how much they're building versus licensing in to create the pipeline?
So I wouldn't say that they've pivoted wholesale to rare. I think what they're doing is diversifying their pipeline in a way that diversifies their risk. Like they certainly feel that rare disease is an area where they can play and win, is the way they talk about it. There are also, a reasonably sized opportunities for a company of their size to go after alone. And some of those are coming in through deals. But they also have some large indication, big risk, but big opportunity bets in their pipeline as well. So they have a Nuplazid follow-on compound that they've inherited from the former management team that it was designed in-house through the use of contractors and whatnot to solve some of the issues of Nuplazid. So dial down the QT elongation that was preventing them from pushing the dose or whatever. And so they're taking that now into Alzheimer's. It's in phase 2 in Alzheimer's psychosis, about to be in phase 2 for Lewy body psychosis. That could be quite a large drug. But then some of the other things are bringing in through deals. Yeah.
Selena, I was just wondering, does this in some ways also just kind of highlight the higher risk that comes with being a neuro-only focused company? Because I feel like I see a lot of parallels though between what Acadia is doing and, for instance, like what Biogen did, right? Because Biogen made that pivot to being a neuro-only focused company, and that eventually proved to be too much from a risk perspective, and they had to re-diversify essentially and get more into immunology and stuff. And so I'm wondering if I just feel like I see a lot of parallels here between the two of them.
Yeah, more than that. I think we're seeing the long-time neuro-focused companies diversify their risk. Before that was also UCB, which also brought, like Biogen, brought in neurology. There was Lundbeck, who's a good maybe comparator to Acadia, a psych company that now also is doing rare disease, some neurology that's rare. I think that we see all the long-time players. I think neuro is still hard. Yeah, we've made a lot of progress. There is a new biomarker toolkit. There are some targets that have some genetic rationale behind them, even if they're not causative in their own right. And so these are all steps in the right direction, but it's still a high-risk area.
I think that's a great takeaway. Just neuro is still really hard.
Yeah.
Selena, one thing you got into in your piece is how the new CEO, Catherine Owen Adams, has rebuilt the team. She took over the top job 10 months ago. She's a commercial leader with experience at BMS and J&J. She's added some people. She's added Thomas Garner as chief commercial, the new SVP of rare disease. That's Allison McMillan Youngblood, and a new head of R&D too, Elizabeth Thompson. She actually joined right before Owen Adams and has since brought on a new VP of Translational Sciences, Rachel Alton.
And now they have a new role for them as part of this whole modernizing company and how they make decisions. They have a chief data and information officer.
Yes.
And
that
I
was
think
just last week, right?
Yeah, that was very recently, last week. Yeah, just before their earnings. And what they keep saying, what they're messaging, right, is by having much closer contact between commercial and R&D, and now, this data and information role and commercial and R&D, they want to be making decisions in a way that really optimizes spots where this company can sort of uniquely play and bring something differentiated to patients.
Excellent. Well, Selena's piece up on biocentury.com. I'll drop a link in the show notes. Company to watch. We'll be watching what they get up to. Now we'll turn to Biosecure. It's back. Originally launched in January of 2024. It has been introduced as an amendment in a must-pass defense bill. And I caught up with Steve on Friday to discuss this right before he skedaddled for vacation. So we'll turn to Steve now and my conversation with him. Steve, let's get right to it. You broke the news on Friday that the Biosecure Act is back. What's the deal?
So it's not called the Biosecure Act. It's an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, but it's very similar to the Biosecure Act. It actually was introduced as an amendment in the Senate on July 31st by Senators Bill Hagerty, Republican of Tennessee, and Gary Peters, a Democrat of Michigan.
Steve, let's back up a bit, as you always like to say to me. Biosecure Act, when did it first come out again? I'm recalling early 2024? And what happened to it?
So actually, the first introduction was in 2023, and it was introduced at that time, like this time, as an amendment to the National Defense Appropriations Bill. It didn't get a lot of publicity. It didn't get enacted as part of the bill. It kind of went away. And then it came roaring back in 2024 as a standalone piece of legislation. It went through a lot of iterations. We certainly talked about it on the podcast a lot. I wrote a lot about it. The core idea is that it's intended to basically drive a wedge between the U.S. biopharmaceutical industry and companies in China that provide services and development services and manufacturing. There are big differences, however, between what's been introduced this time and the Biosecure Act that was narrowly defeated at the end of the session last time. And the differences look like they're intended to make it more likely to pass this time.
What are those differences, Steve?
Okay, so the big complaint that Senator Rand Paul had and that House Democrats had about the Biosecure Act was that it was unfair, that it violated principles of due process because it named specific companies as biotechnology companies of concern. Those are the companies that the act would apply to, without giving them a chance to present any evidence to the contrary.
And just quickly, Steve, I recall it hit two companies quite hard. WuXi AppTec, WuXi Biologic lost billions in market cap. Their stocks only really rebounded this past spring.
That's right. It hit them particularly hard. BGI also was affected. Its stock wasn't as affected because it doesn't rely on the United States nearly as much as WuXi AppTec and WuXi Biologics. There's another company called Complete Genomics, which is a unit of MGI Tech, a Chinese company that would also be severely impacted by the Biosecure Act. So this time, in order to avoid the accusations that the bill didn't provide due process, the new version of it, the version of it that was introduced on July 31st, basically says, okay, well, here's a process for determining what's a biotechnology company of concern. And then it allows the companies that have been identified to rebut those claims. And it even provides, in some cases, for companies an opportunity to mitigate the concerns that have led the process to identify them as biotechnology companies of concern. Now, of course, there's an added layer of complexity, or several, because there always is, right? So one added layer of complexity is that the bill has two different kinds of biotechnology companies of concern, or two buckets that it puts them in, right? One is the one that I just described that goes through an administrative process whereby companies are identified, they have the opportunity to rebut the allegations and even, in some cases, to mitigate them. There's a second category of companies. These are companies that the Department of Defense lists as Chinese military companies that are operating in the U.S. Those companies are automatically labeled biotechnology companies of concern, and the prohibitions in the bill would apply to them. They don't have an ability to appeal that. The DoD list for 2025 includes BGI Genomics, Forensic Genomics International, MGI, and so by extension, Complete Genomics, and Shanghai OriginCell Biologic Cryo Equipment Company.
And of course, speaking of companies like WuXi AppTec, WuXi Biologics, MGI, Complete Genomics, the other companies that were affected by the bill were U.S. biotechs who were left to scramble to figure out an alternative to the services of global CDMOs, as those companies provide a broad range of services, resources to thousands of companies in the West and the East. So, Steve, I'm curious, what's the likely impact of this bill and grandfathering? How will that work?
Okay, so first, the impact. The bill as it's been introduced, and again, one, we don't know whether it's going to be enacted, and two, we don't know whether, if it is enacted, it will be changed between now and then. But as it's drafted now, it looks to me like it would prevent NIH grants to any of the companies that are considered to be biotechnology companies of concern. It would prevent the Veterans Administration from purchasing drugs that were manufactured as a result of ties to the biotechnology companies of concern. And it would probably prevent Medicaid from purchasing those kinds of drugs. It probably wouldn't have any impact on Medicare. Okay, so that's impact. There's a timeline. It's complicated. Within 1 year of enactment of the law, the OMB director, the Office of Management and Budget director, has to publish an initial list of biotechnology companies of concern. That list is generated in consultation with a bunch of other government departments. Within 180 days of the publication of that list, OMB has to publish guidance for executive agencies on how to implement it. Within a year of the publication of that guidance, the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council must update acquisition laws to incorporate those requirements. For companies that are on the DoD list of Chinese military companies operating in the United States, the prohibitions on government contracts and grants take effect 60 days after the Federal Acquisition Regulatory changes are made. For companies that are designated as of concern, using the processes led by OMB, the prohibitions would take effect 180 days after the FAR is revised. But, as you mentioned, grandfathering. The amendment includes a 5-year grandfather clause starting from the time of the FAR revisions for those companies that OMB has designated as biotechnology companies of concern. My reading of it is that it doesn't apply, the grandfathering doesn't apply to the companies that are on the DoD list of Chinese military companies. Now, if all of this hasn't gotten you really confused, you're really very good at following my voice. I would suggest that you go and look at the story that I wrote because it's all spelled out in there and it's a lot easier to understand when you see it in black and white.
Yep. And I'll drop a link in the show notes. It'll also be available at biocenturypodcast.com. And of course, subs can just find it in their usual spot where you find things from Mr. Usden. All right, Steve, enjoy your vacation. We'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot.
All righty, that is it for this week's BioCentury This Week podcast. But we'll be having a special episode focused on China and East-West deals, how they're changing, what's happening in the Hong Kong stock market. We'll have a consultant on cross-border deals, Ji Li. We'll have Mike Hatton from top East-West deal maker, Harbor Biomed, and of course, Frank Ledoux, one of the big names at McKinsey in Asia, who's been on the pod quite a few times before. And we'll have a classic rewind episode of the BioCentury show available on podcast only. David Altshuler from Vertex, he's the CSO. The company announced that he would be retiring next year, so we thought it would be a great time to revisit his conversation with Simone, which took place in March. He told us all about his lifelong fanboy status of Doug Flutie. He has a box of Flutie Flakes on his bookshelf behind him, and he is very happy to talk to you about that. And Simone pressed him on that a little bit. And the BioCentury show will return with its latest new episode. Annalisa Jenkins. Simone, what'd y'all talk about?
We talked about the state of UK biotech. We talked about the incoming, well, kind of already would come in, a new head of MHRA, the UK regulator, who BioCentury will be talking to soon, and the UK government's plan for creating life sciences as part of the cornerstone of its life strategy. Stephen Hansen, of course, has written about this in biotech. Annalisa and I talked about why would this time be different from others, and is it different from others? And we just shot the breeze about a few things.
Excellent. Well, look out for that. That'll be coming out in the third week of August. Thanks for tuning in. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a thumbs up or whatever we have on the site. Leave us a comment, drop us a question. We'd love to hear from you. And we appreciate Kendall Square Orchestra, which produces the music for all of BioCentury's podcasts.